The reason you don't see the videos like you're going to see, the reason there's not fresh and new videos is because they won't let you see them. So when we found out about the videos here at the University of Wisconsin, asked for them, made a legal claim on them, they destroyed 628 of them because they didn't want you to see them. So now we're stuck with having to look at this old footage. The name of the video that you're going to see is called Mice to Men, the Use of Animals in Experimental Psychology. It's 26 minutes long. It was jointly produced by Animals Voice magazine and the Hans Reusch Society. It's an older video. And as I watched it, I thought, well, you know, what criticisms would the animal research community have about this? What would they say about it? And of course, they're going to say, well, those are old images. We don't do things like, look how grainy they are. Look how old they were, you know. So it's sort of interesting. But in fact, the reason that you don't see any of those videos today is because they're not made public. You don't find pictures and photographs in scientific journals of animals being experimented on like you used to. What happened was around the early 1970s, mid-1970s, people started reading those journals and started publicizing that information, getting a hold of videotapes from inside the labs and publicizing them, putting them out, making them available to the public to see. And people became so irate that the vivisection industry essentially went underground. I hope you can see this. It's a picture of a marmoset that's in this restraint device. And this is very, very rare that they would actually even publish a drawing like this. And let me read to you what it said in the paper. It says, the researchers who did this are Nancy Schultz-Darkin, who right now is the chair of one of the oversight committees for research here at the university, and senior researchers Wendy Salzman, David Abbott, somebody else named Tannenbaum, who I'm unfamiliar with. It says in the materials and method, it says that, or in the description of the paper, it says, as an assessment of stress in female marmosets undergoing continuous restraint, hypothalamic push-pull perfusion, and repeated blood sampling from an intravenous cannula, we determined plasma cortisol levels on the 3rd day of restraint during push-pull perfusion. So they put them into this device where they couldn't move and left them there for days, while this thing is stuck down inside their brain so that they can push chemicals into their brains and suck them out. This is what's going on. This is the sort of thing that's going on today. So when you see the videos of what was going on 20 years ago, don't be misled. These are actually very, very similar to the things that are going on today. Two of the people that you're going to see in the video are actually two acquaintances of mine. One's Murray Cohen, who's a psychiatrist, an outspoken opponent of the use of animals in biomedical research, especially in his line of research, psychiatry and psychology. And then the other person is Don Barnes. Don Barnes, actually, maybe some of you know, Don Barnes is actually the person whose research is behind the movie that came out maybe, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Project X. Don Barnes worked at, where did I see that? He worked at the School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio from 1966 to 1979. He was ordered, he was a psychologist, PhD. Barnes was ordered, he had been involved in exposing monkeys who had been trained to operate a joystick. They'd been dosing them with radiation, and then once they were dying from radiation sickness, he was trying to see if they could still operate the joystick. And these experiments went on and on and on. And finally, one day he was ordered to do this again at a dosage level that he knew would have no behavioral effects at all. And he said, well, this is stupid. This is a total waste of time and money and animals. And they said, well, we have to do it because we promised we would provide the data. We know that the results are going to be negative, but we have to do that. And that was apparently his sort of awakening moment, that he realized that the research that was going on was actually was more about money and about generating data than it was about real science. So he refused to do it. They fired him. He went to an appeals court over it. They rehired him and he quit.
When did scientists come to fervently believe that by experimenting on non-human animals, such as rodents, that they could ever gain insights into the complexities of the human mind? Since the beginning of recorded history, there have been attempts to understand the human mind and what causes people to behave as they do. By the late 19th century, great thinkers such as Freud had developed schools of thought about human nature using speculation, intuition, and the study of human experience. Freud and others like William James and Carl Jung developed complex schools of psychological thought which laid the foundation for much of 20th century psychology. They accomplished their pioneering work, as have most of the truly great thinkers in psychology, by clinical observation of human behavior. However, during the time of Freud, other psychologists began experimenting with non-human animals in order to study human behavior. Many scientists felt that psychology was a soft science and that it dealt with the intangible inner psyche of the human mind. In order to develop psychology into a so-called hard science like physiology, they needed hard data such as graphs, charts, and methods of experimentation. So began the field of comparative psychology, which is the study of animal behavior as it relates to the mind of man.
I think that assumption is really a false one, and I think psychology, since the Second World War at least, has jumped on the use of non-human animals in an attempt to be a more legitimate, if you will,
hard
science.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Borrowing the techniques and methodologies and experimental designs of the biologists, perhaps, or even of the physicists in some ways, saying, we have real data here, but those numbers, when they come out, they may not relate to anything. And my belief now is that I wasted a good many years, a lot of lives, a lot of suffering, for nothing. And I really feel that way about the totality of behavioral research. I think it's a ginned-up kind of thing. I think the people that do it most of the time believe in it, just like I used to believe in it. But I really can't see that it has any utility for the human species, and it certainly has none for the other animals.
Although psychology is defined as the science of mental processes and the behavior of an individual, researchers attempt to study human behavior by subjecting non-human animals to experimentation in laboratories. Because psychiatric illness is a human subjective experience, which is the result of social, environmental, genetic, and other factors, it is impossible to study human psychiatric illness in animals. As R. Kumar wrote in a 1974 issue of Psychological Medicine, quote, "It is not surprising that extrapolations from animal experimental data to the psychiatric clinic are closely hedged with caveats." The area of psychology where animals are most utilized in experimentation is in the behavioral sciences. Perhaps the most famous of behavioral experiments were performed by the Russian researcher Pavlov. Pavlov investigated a form of learning he called classical conditioning. In experiments with dogs, Pavlov determined how long it takes a dog to associate the sound of a buzzer with feeding time. Then, in the 1930s and 1940s, B.F. Skinner performed behavioral and learning experiments on pigeons using what came to be known as the Skinner box, which was an isolation chamber whereby the pigeon was induced by electroshock into performing various tasks. Strictly speaking, the behaviorists who dominated the field of psychology for most of the 20th century believed that the complex psychological processes of an organism can be reduced to observable, physical, experimental conditions. They thought that the behavior of animals subjected to food deprivation, loud noise, shock, and other torments in the harsh environment of a laboratory would yield to an understanding of the human mind. Perhaps the basic fallacy in this thinking is best summed up by Jonathan Friedman, professor of psychology at Columbia University, who wrote in 1975, and I quote, "It is both difficult and risky to generalize directly from the behavior of one animal to that of another. It would be a mistake to conclude that dogs act in a particular way just because cats do. or that monkeys act the same way as lions, and it is of course much more difficult to conclude anything about humans from other animals. It is always misleading, often foolish. Let's take a brief look at some of the basic areas of psychological research involving non-human animals, research which every year involves the suffering of millions of animals and the waste of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. In order to study human psychological states of depression, animal researchers induce physical and psychological trauma on animals in laboratories. Instead of studying human clinical data, researchers put mice, rats, or cats into cylinders of water from which there is no escape. They then measure how long it takes the animal to give up hope and submit to drowning. Or perhaps they use shock aversion and repeatedly shock the animal with higher and higher doses of electricity until the animal gives up and submits to the shocking. This is known as learned helplessness. Experimenters explain that these animals are experiencing, quote, abnormal behavior, or that the animals experience, quote, loss of control. Nowhere do they mention the fact that the animals are in pain and are terrified. The earliest experiments in learned helplessness were done by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, where he electrically shocked dogs through a steel grid floor with such intensity and persistence that the dogs simply gave up and were subjected to repeated shocks. Seligman described his experiments, quote, at the onset of electric shock, the dog runs frantically about, defecating, urinating, and howling until it scrambles over the barrier and escapes from the shock. Seligman then strapped the dogs in harnesses and gave them inescapable shock. He found that, quote, a dog previously exposed to inescapable shock may take unlimited shock without escaping or avoiding it all. An original collaborator of Seligman, Stephen Mayer, has repeatedly performed learned helplessness experiments on animals. He recently wrote, quote, it would appear unlikely that learned helplessness is a model of depression in any general sense.
The learned helplessness is supposed to show something about the human condition of depression. And what was done initially, and is still being done today as a matter of fact, is to take rats and dogs and other animals and subject them to uncontrolled shock so that the animal has no recourse but to accept that shock. There's nothing the animal can do. He cannot escape, he cannot make a response or react in any sense to stop the shocking condition. And after a while, the animal becomes completely helpless and simply stops trying to avoid it. So this has been called a learned helplessness. That is, that the animal has learned there's nothing they can do about it. And it's supposedly an analog to human depression. They can now take the animal, chop the animal up, look into the brain, see what kind of neurotransmitters are in various parts of the brain, and try to relate that to some kind of depressive condition. But that's a far cry.
Insane. It sounds like voodoo science in a way.
Well, I consider it voodoo science, and yet during the time that I was trained at Ohio State University, this is where I did my graduate work, one of the better schools in the country for psychology. Everyone followed what his mentor did, and so I did the same thing, obviously.
For decades, non-human animals have been injected, force-fed, and forced to inhale drugs such as barbiturates, amphetamines, LSD, heroin, alcohol, and countless others to study their effects. Often, after becoming physically addicted to these substances, the animals are abruptly withdrawn from them, causing them great pain. While under the influence of these drugs, the animal is subjected to various behavioral experiments which involve electroshock, loud noise, and other conditions which the researchers like to call, quote, aversive stimuli. An example of such research is the barbiturate experiments at Cornell University in New York involving the addiction of cats to barbiturates. For over 12 years, researchers inserted tubes into the stomachs of cats and pumped in massive quantities of barbiturates, enough to addict them. Then the barbiturates were abruptly withdrawn, and the cat's convulsions were observed and recorded. In 1988, public protests led by Trans-Species Unlimited forced Cornell to stop the barbiturate experiments on cats.
Rats won't drink alcohol. They loathe alcohol. They have to be forced to drink alcohol by causing them to be dehydrated almost to the point of death. And even then, they sometimes won't drink alcohol. So the way that they're made alcoholic is by forcing them to breathe alcohol vapors. So that they've developed an illness that is supposed to be a model for a human illness, but they detest the very thing that the human being who has the illness craves. So how that's a model for the human illness is really beyond my comprehension. Also, biochemically, a lot of these drugs have paradoxical effects, so-called paradoxical effects, when they're compared to the effects that they have on human beings. For example, morphine is an excitor of cats, so that if cats would be and have been used for morphine studies, the results would be completely non-applicable. Several years ago, primates were used to prove that cocaine is a highly desirable drug, and that these primates would use cocaine to the point of neglecting other needs to the point of death. This was already known by anyone who studied human beings. I see in my practice, in my hospital experience, time and time again, people using cocaine at the expense of everything else to the point of death. We've read about famous people who've died of cocaine abuse. And in spite of that, in spite of the fact that we have done to animals what we already know in human beings, the same experiments are being done time and time again.
And these they keep bringing up the same results?
The same results. The only thing that changes is the animal. First we find it in primates, then we find it in rats, then we find it in dogs.
At the University of Wisconsin in the 1940s, Harry Harlow began experimenting with monkeys in order to study human mother-infant bonding and love. To do this, he isolated the babies from their mothers and subjected them to what Harlow called, quote, pits of despair, the name of which he came up with in what he described as, quote, a moment of gleeful abandon. The monkeys were also subjected to surgery, starvation, electrical shock, and what Harlow named monster mothers. Harlow devised many different hellish schemes in order to drive the monkeys into a state of psychosis. As he stated, quote, in our study of psychopathology, we began as sadists trying to produce abnormality. The monkeys would rock back and forth crying, grimacing, or huddling against a wall. In a 1962 issue of the Journal of Comparative and Physiological Psychology, Harlow wrote, quote, most experiments are not worth doing, and most data obtained are not worth publishing. In the October 27, 1974 issue of the Pittsburgh Press, Harlow said, and I quote, the only thing I care about is whether the monkeys will turn out a property I can publish. I don't have any love for them. I really don't like animals. I despise cats. I hate dogs. How can you like monkeys?
The Harlow experiments involved the use of primates and maternal deprivation, whereby a wire-made mother surrogate was used in place of the actual mother of a baby primate. And rather than being able to cling to its mother, the baby primate clung to this inanimate object. And lo and behold, they found out that these baby primates grew up to be disturbed because their mother was taken away. Well, anybody who's followed psychiatric research involving human beings, the work of Spitz and the work of Mahler and the work of Stella Chess and a whole bunch of other people, knows that, and just being in practice and observing people and having experience clinically, would know that this is the case. Harlow himself, toward the end of his career, cast doubt on the legitimacy of all of his experimentation. He essentially said something like, thus we've spent 20 or 25 or 30 years and X millions or billions of dollars finding out what any sensible person would have already known, which of course is true.
Still being carried on.
His experiments continue to this day. They're going on right now.
In the laboratory, animals are subjected to sleep deprivation studies which are supposed to yield answers as to why human beings have trouble sleeping, and also to study the effects of sleeplessness. Besides the questionable utility of such experiments, the animal suffering is immense. This fully conscious, unanesthetized cat is undergoing a sleep deprivation study. Animals are brain shocked into seizures, given drugs, and then forced to remain awake for long periods of time, sometimes days. As with this cat, they are then implanted with electrodes and their physiological processes are monitored. The brain is then exposed to observe the effects of sleeplessness on the animal. In other experiments at the University of Chicago, researchers who were funded by the National Institute of Mental Health began their research protocol by stating, quote, "The issue of whether sleep is physiologically necessary has been unresolved." So they deprived 8 rats of sleep for up to 33 days by placing them on discs which rotated if the animal began to fall asleep. The rats were forced to walk or fall into water. After the rats had undergone this suffering, they were killed and autopsied. The researchers then concluded, quote, "These results support the view that sleep does serve a vital physiological function."
When I saw that, I said, my God, you know, all of us knew that from the moment we were able to communicate with anyone else. And when I brought this up to psychologists, eminent psychologists in the field, several of them scratched their head and said, well, I see your point, but it was such an elegant design. This experiment had never been done that way before.
So it's a demonstration of an experiment.
Yes, of course.
That's what they're interested in.
It's again, it's putting yourself in that little pigeonhole and saying, look what I've done that no one else has done.
Researchers, in order to study what makes human beings violent and aggressive, will force animals into aggressive behaviors in the laboratory. As Dr. Dallas Pratt, former associate psychiatrist at Columbia University, wrote, quote, "Electric shocks are delivered to the feet of the animals or directly into the brain through implanted electrodes. Aggression-stimulating drugs are injected. Parts of the brain are surgically removed and animals from the outside are introduced into a resident colony. These fights between animals are stimulated by a group of investigators who, if they were promoting fights between larger animals, such as cocks or dogs, would be prosecuted under the Animal Welfare Act. As a result, pretentious-sounding papers earn researchers master's degrees, doctorates, and funding," end quote. Even though there are willing volunteers in prison populations who undergo clinical analysis to help researchers find out what makes a human being violent, government funding for these animal experiments continues unabated. We're now going to show you some footage taken by researchers themselves of one such aggression experiment done at Stony Brook, New York on the SUNY campus. This domesticated ferret was forced to attack the domesticated rabbit while SUNY experimenters Dr. George Williams and Mitchell Beam observed. Beam later told investigators from People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals that he did similar research in his own backyard, quote, "for personal enjoyment."
We're going back through the skull. That's why it normally happens.
Mitchell and Beam set up similar demonstrations using ferrets, mice, and rats. According to psychologist Dr. Randall Lockwood, quote, "I was appalled by what can only be described as voyeuristic cruelty masquerading as science." Experiments on pain perception in animals have been performed for decades. Animals are routinely given pain-enhancing drugs. Then they are subjected to electroshock and forced to run on treadmills. Other experiments involve placing animals on hot plates or putting them in microwave ovens. After placing electrodes in the animals' heads, researchers will then subject them to hot air blast, caustic substances, and often pinch the animal's extremities to observe painful reactions. In many such pain experiments, researchers will place microphones in front of the animal's mouth to record the animal screaming. In their reports, researchers refer to the screams as, quote, vocalizations. Amazingly, many psychological researchers do not even acknowledge that non-human animals can even feel pain. Listen as noted psychological researcher Peter Milner describes in a 1975 interview his experience of pain in animals. Note how he refers to the animal as a, quote, mechanism.
I think it was Delgado at Yale who introduced a convenient sort of electrode for chronic implantation. And this was the type of electrode that I started to use. It consisted of a number of wires stuck together with some sort of cement. You placed it in position in a stereotaxic instrument and attached it to the skull with dental cement. And then the ends of these wires were tucked down under the skin and out of a hole at the back of the neck with a plug on. And you just plugged it into the back of the neck. You sutured the scalp back so you didn't have any possibility of infection. And I used this for the experiments I was doing on stimulating the reticular formation, the arousal system, which was part of my thesis eventually. And now, a purist in this area could point out that you only know your pain, and as far as you know, nobody else experiences anything at all like that. When you start talking about animals, it does become a more serious problem, because we have no real idea of what an animal feels when we give it a shock or stick a pin in it or something of that sort. It may feel something like we do, or it may not. Certainly you can conceive of mechanisms that would stop, stop performing if you press a certain button. But if you tried to maintain that they were experiencing something similar to what I experienced when you stick a pin in me, you'd have trouble.
In the brief space of this program, it is impossible to delve into all of the areas of animal use in the field of experimental psychology. We have tried to give you some idea of the inherent cruelty and scientific invalidity of psychological research on non-human animals. As psychologist B.E. Rowlands wrote in 1981, and I quote, "Suffering is essential to psychological research in a way that is unparalleled in all other research." In 1985, psychologist Michael Gianelli wrote, referring to animal researchers in the field of psychology, quote, "We have learned that people can become remarkably desensitized and detached from the suffering they inflict upon animals. We have learned that highly intelligent people can be engaged in the most trivial or eccentric research, yet convince themselves that their work is important."
I firmly believe, as a scientist, that there would be absolutely no detrimental effect of ceasing all behavioral experimentation yesterday, and that all effects would be positive. I would like to see that happen. Why should these animals suffer at all? Why should any of them suffer for these kinds of things? Even if you adopt the ends justifies the means philosophy, which I don't, but even if you did, I don't think that you can point to any ends with the behavioral experiment.
Especially in psychology, perhaps more than any other field, the only subject to study is the human being, because for the very reason that they justify animals for other kinds of experimentation, that is that they're sufficiently different than we are so that there are no moral considerations to be had in using them. For that very reason, in psychology, which is clearly the key difference between us and animals, and non-human animals, the fact that we have a conceptual consciousness, and we, to our knowledge, animals don't, although they may. Chimpanzees may, and gorillas may, and dolphins may. But the point is, we're not sure about that. It is clear that human beings, most human beings have, and other groups of human beings, infants, for example, have the capacity to have a conceptual consciousness. That's the key to our psychology. Then to use animals for psychology experiments conceptually makes no sense whatsoever. So I think that each time that that's done, it sets back the field.
Psychology is somehow claiming that the foundation of its enterprise is animal research. When you go out into the field and look at people who are using psychological knowledge, they're not using it.
It's not based on the animal research.
It's based on clinical, epidemiological studies.
If someone asked me, as a result of 8 to 10 years of laboratory research, what points I proved, could I explain to anyone any points that I made, I honestly can't.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're honest about that, because I think that would be the majority of researchers.
Oh, I know a number of my colleagues, and I'm going to be very happy to hear that.
The only thing that psychological testing on animals proves is how warped human psychology is, I think. It's never produced, I think, any meaningful and important result. What we find out finally that helps human beings is what we find helps human beings, not what we find helps non-human animals. And especially at a time when we have people with serious psychological problems, we're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on dead-end research involving non-human animals, instead of taking that money and allocating it to meaningful social programs and rehabilitation programs, mental health care facilities, alcohol rehabilitation programs, all these things where the money is drying up. We continue to pump it in. I mean, the National Institutes of Health is not losing any money. The National Institutes of Mental Health, in particular, not losing any contracts. What we need to do is to begin where we can exercise control over where our dollars are spent that bring us important human benefits, and they certainly are not well spent on these hopeless and duplicative and indefensible psychological research on animals.
The use of non-human animals in psychological testing is not only immoral, it's scientifically invalid. As Alexander Pope once said, the proper study of man is mankind.